Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sven Hackman, and I am the Vice President for the U.S. Cities Program within Siemens. It is my pleasure to introduce the next discussion, which will focus on the neuroscience of happiness. I have to admit, when I was first offered the opportunity to introduce the topic, I was a little bit stumped. How on earth do I make the link between city infrastructure development and this? Well, since 2007, more than half of the world's population, or about 3.3 billion people, live in cities, a number expected to swell to almost 5 billion people by 2030 or 9 billion people by 2050. So clearly the challenges presented by sustainable urban development are immense. And to provide you with some data points, cities are responsible for around 75% of all energy consumed, 60% of all water used, and 80% of all greenhouse gases produced worldwide. So today, Siemens is advising several city governments around the globe on how to make use of worldwide best practices and technologies in this regard. And to do a shameless plug, I invite all of you to join us tomorrow morning at 8:30 a.m. just across the hall at the Siemens Pavilion, also known as the gym, for the first U.S.-Canada Green City Index. We worked with the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU, to evaluate 20 cities in the U.S. and Canada to look at their work in sustainability and environmental performance. Now, I know that building city infrastructures does not seem to have a lot to do with neuroscience or happiness, but we can all relate to how very important it is to have the right environment around you and a strong sense of community. Because at the end of the day, quality of life and happiness are all tied to a sustainable city. And with that, I'd like to introduce the moderator, Professor Daniel Gilbert.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm Dan Gilbert. I'm very pleased to be moderating this session on neuroscience and happiness. Last year, I co-wrote and hosted a television series for PBS called This Emotional Life. And I'm on camera and I say this line. I say to the audience, human emotions like love, anger, and happiness are generated deep within the brain. And the director yells, cut, cut, cut. I said, what's wrong? He said, typo, you mean heart, right? I said, no, dude, not heart. Brain. The brain is where emotions happen. But the brain isn't just the location for happiness. What we're learning about the brain and how it generates emotions is teaching us not only about emotions, but about the brain itself. It's one of the greatest sources of mystery, and we're about to have a lot of that mystery revealed today by two of the best neuroscientists in the world, Kent Berridge and Richie Davidson. Delighted to have them here. Kent Berridge. To my far left is the James Old Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Michigan. Kent has spent his entire career studying the neural basis of pleasure, and especially the distinction between wanting things and liking things. Now, I can tell you from experience, studying this distinction in human beings is hard enough. That wasn't hard enough for Kent. He studies it in rats, who make the distinction between liking and wanting, and if you know how to ask them, they will tell you. I invited Kent, I must say, I organized a conference between psychologists and economists about a decade ago, I think, in Brussels. And the whole idea was to get economists to see how important psychology was for economics. So I invited all these great psychologists and one neuroscientist. And Kent came and talked about the rat brain. And I asked the economists at the end, what do you think? Does psychology have a lot of promise for your discipline? And they said, yeah, the psychology stuff was all right, but that rat stuff, that's important. Who knew? My friend Richie Davidson is the William James and Villis Professor, Research Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Richie has, if you know anything about neuroscience, you know he has almost single-handedly pioneered the study of meditation and the brain. One of my favorite photographs is of Richie lugging a magnetic resonance imaging machine up a mountain in Nepal so that he can scan the brains of monks as they generate loving kindness. It's only one of the many things in our discipline for which Richie is famous. I was not at all surprised, but impressed when in 2006, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. I suspect since then many of those other people have died, so you're even more influential. You may be among the top 94, 93, something like that. In any case, it's my pleasure to be hosting this. I'm so excited to hear from both of you. Our plan is for each of these gentlemen to talk for 20 minutes. We'll have a very brief discussion and then invite all of you in. Kent, if you'd start us off.
Thank you, Dan. I know Richie and I are delighted to be here and very grateful for all the Aspen hospitality and also especially for Dan's efforts in organizing the happiness track as well as moderating these sessions. We don't yet have a neuroscience of happiness in a full-fledged sense, at least not in the sense that we have a neuroscience of memory or vision or pain or hunger, in the sense that we could draw upon hundreds of studies and tell you about results on the neuroscience of happiness. We don't yet have that. But we do have a neuroscience on relevant facts about brain mechanisms of pleasure and generating of hedonic states, and brain mechanisms of meaning. And I'm going to focus mostly on pleasure and hedonic states. I think Richie will be talking about meaning networks. And in the domain of hedonic neuroscience, I'd like to really just talk about two ideas today. The first idea is that, as Dan said, we have in our brains a very ancient and deep network for generating hedonic feelings. This network evolved for sensory pleasures, for selfish pleasures, but it's been co-opted by our evolution, and it participates in all of our pleasures, and quite likely even in sustained well-being, the positive affect of happiness for those who have it and when they have it. And the second idea I'd like to talk about was also, Dan mentioned, it's the notion that wanting and liking the same pleasure are very different from the brain's point of view, so different that it has different systems for wanting and liking the same pleasure. And these evolved also together, and it's a very good thing that they go together, but sometimes they can come apart from each other, and it happens in addiction, in extreme cases, and it could happen in all of us sometimes, and that can lead to a recipe for unhappiness. So those are the two ideas I'll talk about. And to start, maybe it's best to just consider what's the relationship of pleasure to happiness. It's a topic that's been discussed several times already in the happiness track. And one answer, if we pose the question, what's the relationship between happiness and pleasure? An answer came from Freud long ago. This is actually a quote that I took from Dan's book. Freud says, the answer to happiness is pleasure, pure and simple. That's what people want. They want to be free from pain and displeasure, and they want to experience strong feelings of pleasure. For Freud, happiness was merely pleasure. But in this track, on the last 2 days, we've heard again and again that happiness is more than pleasure. There's the other aspect. There's the eudaimonic aspect of meaning and life engagement, of compassion for others and love in life. Both are important in happiness, eudaimonia and hedonia. I can only talk about the hedonic brain mechanisms of happiness. But both occur together quite often, it seems, as a matter of fact, in happy people. They go together very often. Those who are happy are reported to feel both kinds. I'm drawing on studies by Ed Diener at the University of Illinois, who sort of pioneered a lot of the well-being research. And in his studies, eudaimonic satisfaction, people rate 80% of the people sampled rate that they're pretty satisfied to very satisfied with their accomplishments and meaning in life. And 80% of them also report that they have a happy hedonic mood. Again, pretty happy to happy or very happy. Both are important. When Marty Seligman told us yesterday about the PERMA system, positive affect, the P in PERMA, is pleasure and hedonics. It's the positive affect. The rest of it, engagement and meaning and accomplishment in life, that's the eudaimonic aspect. But today, for this moment, pleasure. An important point about pleasure is that it comes from within. It comes from within us. It's not just a part of our experience. It's been mentioned in a couple of times in the track that happiness researchers like to draw upon the notion that paraplegics have been reported to have fairly good life satisfaction. And just a few months ago, an even more dramatic case of happiness free from external constraints was reported in locked-in patients. Locked-in patients in a study done in England. Locked-in patients of the sort depicted in the movie, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, the French movie. Locked-in patients may be entirely paralyzed to the extent that they can move only an eyelid or not even an eyelid, maybe only an eye, vertical movements of the eye up and down. Yet they can communicate. If posed questions, they can use those movements to communicate. And if asked how they feel, the results of the study on locked-in patients was that over 70% of these patients reported their sense of well-being as +3 on a hedonic scale between -5 to +5. +3 corresponds to a rating of very well, although they're entirely paralyzed and can move only an eye. Very well. It lies between well, which would be 2 on the scale, and 4, which would be almost as good as the best period in my earlier life before I developed the locked-in syndrome. It's a syndrome that develops from a brain lesion, usually in the brainstem, that blocks all movement, but leaves cognition and consciousness and sensation all intact. It's kind of a demonstration of the hedonic resiliency that we have, and maybe a demonstration of the hedonic immune system, the affective immune system that Dan has written about in his work. Well, the idea is that this from within hedonic state, the idea is that it's coming from very deep brain circuits. That's something I'd like to spend a couple of minutes on, very deep brain circuits. People may report sense of well-being, but they're not quite as happy as they could be, at least many of us. There may be ways to maximize that happiness. The brain systems that generate hedonic states are there, but they're not operating at their fullest all the time. Moments can activate these circuits, sensory pleasures of foods and drugs and sex. Human cognitive pleasures of humor, winning money, seeing the face of your loved one, your child or your spouse. Abstract pleasures like art and music and social and moral pleasures all have been reported to activate these same brain systems that evolved originally for sensory pleasures and that can be studied even in animals. And that raises the possibility. This is the hypothesis. It's not a fact, but it's the hypothesis extrapolating from that the same brain mechanisms for sensory pleasures and abstract pleasures, momentary pleasures, could be called upon to generate the sort of sustained or frequent sense of well-being that isn't tied to a particular event, but that pervades all events or as a free-floating state that allows us to be content and happy in this room, or happy as we leave, or go home, or driving, or as we meet someone new. That kind of well-being that engenders a hedonic moment could call upon these brain circuits. I'd say it's not a fact because we can't point to studies that will prove this, but we can extrapolate from what we know. So I'd like to tell you a bit about what is this circuit, and here's a bit. In the brain, there are deep looping circuits that go from the top of the brain, the cortex, down to the very, very deepest center of the brain. And we could perhaps divide the parts and the functions into 3 simple functions. One function is to code pleasure, and the whole system code pleasure. That is, it lights up whenever we're in a state or a moment of hedonic pleasure. And the prefrontal cortex is especially good for lighting up with coding pleasure. Another function is to cause the pleasure. There's a little difference between coding and causing the pleasure we'll talk about in a moment. And deep structures cause the pleasure with names like nucleus accumbens and ventral pallidum. And a third function is to want the pleasure that we like. And the brain dopamine system that starts very, very deep in the midbrain and goes up to the front is a generator of wanting. We'll talk about that. So one at a time. First, coding pleasure. Maybe to make it concrete, an example. The taste of chocolate so many of us like codes pleasure beautifully, and it codes changes of pleasure, the frontal cortex. A person who tastes a bit of chocolate, who loves chocolate, will light up their orbital frontal, their frontal cortex. And as they get full, if they eat several bars of chocolate and it begins to become, you feel just a little queasy and the chocolate isn't quite so good, the cortex goes down. It's coding the pleasure. But there is a difference between coding a pleasure and causing that pleasure. The brain, as a general rule, has more codes than causes. Only few of the brain sites that light up and code the pleasure actually also cause the pleasure that it's coding. The other sites are doing their own thing, causing their own things, causing attention to the pleasure, or memory of the pleasure, or thoughts about the pleasure, or conscious savoring of the pleasure in various ways. But the actual generation of the pleasure itself, that's restricted to a few sites, and we have to manipulate the brain or rely upon natural manipulations or medical manipulations that have been done to see what in the brain is causing pleasure. So the first thing is the cortex may not be causing our pleasure. The top of our brain may not be causing our pleasure. Pleasure may be caused really deep within. And one very old but massive fact is that thousands and thousands of people lost their frontal cortex, their prefrontal cortex, between the 1930s to the 1960s through the operation of prefrontal lobotomy, as in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And in that operation, the prefrontal lobe is either removed or severed, so it's no longer connected to the rest of the brain. And afterwards, as has been pointed out, studied beautifully by Antonio Damasio and his colleagues, dangerous decisions, risky decisions are made by a person who's lost their prefrontal cortex. But pleasures remain after cortical loss. And sometimes even new pleasures come in because the person is socially inappropriate or makes risky, bad decisions in many cases and finds new socially inappropriate pleasures. And there are very dramatic examples, too, in people, a few but dramatic examples, such as occasional children who are born congenitally without any cortex at all. Severe hydranencephaly is one example where a child can miss virtually the entire cortex. The brain develops normally below, but not with a cortex. And yet a child like this has been reported. You can see the brain and you can see the emptiness of where the cortex should be at the top of the scans. The child's reported to still smile when spoken to by family and caretakers, and to giggle when played with. And these human interactions of positive affect were more intense than and qualitatively different from other positive affects to things like favorite toys and music. And we're seeing in the photograph him responding to music and cooing and making facial expressions. So the pleasure may arise, at least be generated below the cortex, and that's almost surprising that the very deep ancient brain is generating the pleasure. And we can find the pleasure causers, the pleasure generators in the brain. I want to, in a minute, just give a quick example of an experiment that finds the pleasure-generating network, the kind of research that can be done that, to find hedonic hotspots, which are pleasure generators deep in the brain, actually causing pleasure. A sample experiment would be to tweak the brain, turn it on in one place, in one kind of neuronal system, an opioid system. Tweak it with a painless microinjection. This can only be done in animals, so we'll have to address the hard question that Dan raised. But we can find where tweaks enhance the pleasure of a sensation. How to ever know in a rat whether a brain tweak has enhanced the pleasure of sensation? The rat can't tell us a thing. Well, of course, human infants can't tell us a thing either, but parents and grandparents may have a sense of when the infant likes, say, a sweet taste and doesn't like another taste. Here's an infant on the first day of life, a human infant, who will get a sweet taste, a squirt of sugar water in the mouth, and then we'll see a rat getting a squirt of sugar water, and then we'll see a human infant getting bitterness, and we'll see the rat do the same. Here's the infant, just got a squirt of sugar water and sort of tongue protrusion. Here's the rat from underneath. Sugar water is being infused into its mouth painlessly through an oral cannula. And we're seeing these tongue protrusions. We have to slow it down because the rat moves so fast, but we can see it from underneath, the licking of the lips to the sugar that it likes. Now here's bitterness. Gapes and scrunching of the eyes. And we get a sense that that's a very different hedonic experience. And here's the rat getting bitterness and gaping. The rat can't scrunch its nose or eyes. It doesn't have the musculature, but it can gape and flail its paws and shake its head and do a number of other things. Now the point is, if we tweak the brain and we change displeasure to pleasure, we can change the gaping reaction to bitterness into a sweet-like reaction. We can make nice things nicer. We can make nasty things less nasty, and sometimes make nasty things even nice. But there's very few places in the brain that can do this. Here's an example where it's in orange. We're seeing where little painless microinjections, each little splotch is a microinjection, the size and shape of it, that's activating some neurons where the microinjection is. But the color of the microinjection is its consequence. This is a causal map. It's not a neuroimaging map of coding. This is a causation map where the color is showing the psychological effects, switching those gaping reactions to bitterness into a sweet reaction and increasing the liking reactions to an already sweet taste. Where it's red and orange, that it can do. That site is the front orange site in the deep brain, and there's a couple of other hedonic hotspots in the brain that can cause pleasure. They're all interconnected. They work as a network, fragile, but they call on each other as a network. When one comes on, it calls on the other, and the other comes on too. And if we were to stop one from coming on, the enhanced pleasure would go away. It's a fragile network. It needs all to come on. It needs unanimity in the network in order to cause an increase in pleasure. There's several spots, as I say, in accumbens and ventral pallidum. They use a couple of neurochemicals to cause this. One is natural heroin opioids that the brain makes. Another is natural marijuana endocannabinoids that the brain makes and releases to create these pleasures. The circuit functions as a whole. But all of that was pleasure. And remember, the notion is that that system, when activated in fortunate people, might also be the generator of hedonic, sustained happiness that makes not only sweetness nice, but makes not life nice if one can activate it in a more frequent or sustained manner. The last idea for me to mention is the wanting versus liking idea. With this hedonic generating circuit, there's other components. One famous component you may recognize is dopamine, long thought to be a pleasure generator in the brain. Dopamine, a pleasure generator. But it turns out on closer look that it's not a pleasure generator. It's a reward generator. It helps to generate reward, but reward is complicated. Pleasure is just one part, and wanting for the pleasure is another part that dopamine generates almost exclusively, and not the pleasure at all. There are dramatic examples. There's a couple of very dramatic examples of false pleasure electrodes that would have turned on this system to activate the brain mesolimbic system. And there's many examples in society, perhaps in addicts today, who have wanting without liking. I'll give just a very quick, brief, classic pleasure electrode that perhaps isn't a pleasure electrode. These were implanted first in the 1960s. There's still going on deep brain stimulation today, but the pleasure electrodes were electrodes that were implanted, and a person had a button box, much like this slide controller. You could press the button and turn on your pleasure or turn on your electrode. One of the most famous patients was B19, a young man implanted with the electrode. He would stimulate the button box over 1,500 times in a single 3-hour session. And he'd protest, "Just a few more, please," if you tried to take the stimulator away. It was apparently a pleasure electrode, and it was reported to produce feelings of alertness and warmth and goodwill. He had feelings also of sexual arousal. These electrodes and turning on the system often turns on motivation, whether it's for sex or food or drugs or other things. And it produced in him a compulsion to masturbate. But was it really pleasant, this electrode? You know, he's never actually reported as saying that it was. He's never actually reported as saying, "That feels nice," when he pushes the button. There aren't exclamations of pleasure, and the electrode never substitutes for a real pleasure like sex. It only, when it's on, makes him want the sex more, just as it makes him want to push the button more. It's an odd sort of psychological experience. But there may be many thousands of people or more who have something approaching this because of something that can happen in the brains of some addicts. This is the notion of incentive sensitization. Everybody probably knows that drugs of abuse can activate brain systems, including some of us, you may know, that brain dopamine systems. But they don't only activate those systems. In some people, they can permanently change the systems and crank them up. Not all the time. The systems aren't cranked up all the time. But they're cranked up in a way that they can be turned on in a hyper-expressive way to release more dopamine than normal when the drug is taken again or when cues for the drug are encountered again. This is neuronal sensitization of the dopamine system, produced in vulnerable individuals, not everybody is vulnerable, produced by high doses and produced when the doses especially are taken in binge-like fashion, sensitization. And the crucial thing about dopamine sensitization is that if it's produced, once it's produced, it doesn't go away when the person stops taking the drug. This change can last for years. Even in animals that live only a couple of years, it may last a lifetime. And it may contribute to relapse later, this wanting kind of system. So I'll stop and just say, this has been talking about, or I should say, that is, of course, a recipe for great unhappiness, this sensitized wanting system. To want and even to obtain what is wanted isn't necessarily going to turn on the pleasure liking. And this, if it happens, can happen again and again and again. Dan's work, for example, has shown that many people can want things inappropriately, miswant things based on false expectations and false theory about whether they'll like it. But this system, once you have sensitization of this wanting system, you can persist in the miswanting even once you know, even once your theory has that opportunity to be corrected. So to stop, eudaimonia is the big question, and I can't even address it. I think that Richie will. But I can say that the brain hedonic networks I've mentioned connect to the networks that have been proposed for having concepts of self in relation to other concepts of meaning in life. Hedonic circuits activate that. So we don't have a neuroscience of hedonic happiness yet, but we do have a hedonic neuroscience of pleasures that may be relevant to understanding happiness, and it suggests a few insights perhaps. Namely, that pleasure is generated very deep within the brain by an ancient system when it happens, but that may be called upon in the fortunate to generate true hedonic well-being. Pleasure wanting is a separate system, and that can lead to great unhappiness. Pleasure links to circuits of meaning, and it may be possible to map some of this neuroscience onto concepts of happiness, such as, is happiness a state of sustained liking or well-being without any wanting to disrupt and torment us? That can be conceived in neuroscience terms. Or is it a state of sustained well-being and hedonic pleasure in daily life with a mild activation of the dopamine wanting system that can make people attractive and places attractive and events attractive and give us a zest to life? Too much, of course, would be unhappy. Or is it something else? Well, that we can only think about. Thanks. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Your turn.
Okay, thank you, Dan, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. I want to begin today with, if we can have the slides on, a very brief autobiographical interlude, and just to situate what I'm about to describe. I was in graduate school in the 1970s at Harvard, and I had the great fortune of, in addition to the wonderful mentors I had as faculty, to encounter people outside of the academy whose demeanor and whose presence and, frankly, whose very infectious well-being was something that was very attractive to me. And one of the things I learned about these people that they had in common is they all had a connection to and an interest in meditation and spiritual matters. And this kindled, very early on in my career, an interest in this subject. I was sufficiently interested that after my second year of graduate school, to the consternation of some faculty, I went off to India for the first time and had a taste of what this kind of practice actually did for me and for myself. And I came back with great enthusiasm and with a conviction that these were methods that were very important for Western psychology and neuroscience to take account of. But it was very clear that the zeitgeist in that day was not sufficiently receptive to pursue this kind of research at that time. And so it took many years for this to all come full circle. And then in 1992, I had the opportunity to meet for the first time His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And I met with him at his residence in India, and that was a meeting that I think is fair to say changed the course of my life and of my career. The Dalai Lama was quite forceful and said, look, you guys are using the tools of modern science to study qualities like anxiety and fear and depression. Why can't you use those same tools to study qualities like kindness and compassion? And there wasn't really a good answer other than the fact that the study of kindness and compassion is hard. But, it was hard when we began to study fear and anxiety, and I think there has been very good progress in modern neuroscience and psychology in the understanding of those constructs. So I made a commitment on that day to the Dalai Lama that I was going to do everything I could to help put these kinds of positive qualities on the scientific map. And it took us a number of years to ramp up, but that really brings us to the present. But I want to tell you one other little story about what happened during one of my early visits to the Dalai Lama in India. We were sitting around, and this is directly germane to the focus of the theme on happiness that Dan so beautifully put together. We were sitting around in a very informal moment, and I was with this Japanese scientist who was a very interesting Japanese scientist, and he leans over and he said to the Dalai Lama, Your Holiness, can you please tell us the time in your life when you were the most happy? And I thought, gee, that was a really interesting question. I wonder what this answer is going to be. And just like that, without pausing, the Dalai Lama said, I think right now. So that was a very important lesson for me about what his understanding of happiness was and the capacity for happiness to be not a state, but a trait that is an enduring quality and something that also might be cultivated through training. So I want to first begin with some of our more mainstream work, and one of the ideas that we have been studying in the laboratory is this idea of what we've called affective chronometry, which simply refers to the time course of emotional responding, and where we've been interested in tracing networks in the brain that are associated with these issues of time course, which I'll explain in a moment. And one of the things that is compelling to me about this notion of time course is that when we think about differences among people and how they respond to life's slings and arrows, a lot of it has to do with the time course of emotional responding. So people who we consider to be very, very resilient, in the face of adversity, they're able to recover quickly. So this idea of faster recovery following adversity. And there are also individuals who can savor and show an enduring expression of positive emotion based upon having some experience, for example, in the morning, if they reflect on the things in their life that they're grateful for, it may color their entire day. And that kind of long time course for positive emotions and short time course for negative emotions is something that we can actually interrogate with modern technology and concepts in neuroscience. And I'll just give you one very, very recent example. And this comes from a large study which is funded by the National Institute on Aging that's focused on well-being in aging. And we have the opportunity to bring a subset of these individuals into our laboratory. And one of the things that all of these people are given, and this is a representative sample across the United States, one of the things they're given are these questionnaire measures of well-being, and these are some items that reflect what Kent introduced as eudaimonic well-being. So, for example, people would describe me as a giving person willing to share my time with others. Most people see me as loving and affectionate. I am an active person in carrying out the plans I set for myself. In general, I feel confident and positive about myself. So those are some examples of these items. And we were interested in whether individuals who report themselves as displaying these high levels of well-being have a signature in their brain that reflects an enduring and longer duration of activation in brain circuits that are important for at least aspects of positive emotion. That's one more item. I made some mistakes in the past, but I feel all in all, everything has worked out for the best. So one of the areas in the brain that Kent mentioned, deep within the brain, the nucleus accumbens, is an area where we find that sustained activation over time, not punctate activation, but sustained activation over time, is associated with these reports of naturally occurring well-being. And this just shows a scatter plot that indicates that those individuals that have more sustained activation in this brain region are also reporting higher levels of well-being on this index that reflects primarily eudaimonic well-being. So this is a picture of the first time the Dalai Lama visited our laboratory in Madison in 2001, and he is here in the MRI control room. And he's been a real inspiration and has been extremely interested in the details of this work. And with his encouragement, we began a very unusual study in 2001 where we've brought very long-term practitioners of certain kinds of meditation practices that are explicitly designed to enhance eudaimonic well-being. And we've brought them into the laboratory and we've interrogated their brains to see how their brains may have changed in response to this kind of mental training. So one question which you might ask is, what does compassion have to do with happiness? And I want to just share with you a couple of quotes, and this comes from the Dalai Lama, and he said, "From my own limited experience, I have found that the greatest degree of inner tranquility comes from the development of love and compassion. The more we care for the happiness of others, the greater our own sense of well-being becomes. Cultivating a close, warm-hearted feeling for others automatically puts the mind at ease. This helps remove whatever fears or insecurities we may have and gives us the strength to cope with any obstacles we encounter. It is the ultimate source of success in life." So this is really the seeds of why we were so interested in understanding more about what is going on in the brains when these practitioners were generating compassion. And this is a scientific example. This was a paper published by some social psychologists that was published in Science a couple of years ago, and I just underlined one or two sentences in the abstract where they said they found that spending more of one's income on others predicted greater happiness, and participants who were randomly assigned to spend money on others experienced greater happiness than those assigned to spend money on themselves. Again, suggesting that even using fairly trivial kinds of manipulations that can be done in the laboratory, you find that being generous to others actually helps to promote happiness in oneself. So we began the study of the voluntary cultivation of compassion to see how that is affecting the brain. And we began in a very simple-minded way where we just had these long-term practitioners who spent years training their mind come into the laboratory and alternate between these conditions where they're in a neutral state and in this state where they're generating compassion. So they just cycle between the neutral and the compassion state. And in the words of one of our practitioners who is sitting in our audience, who's been a prominent member of the happiness theme this week, Mathieu Ricard, he said that what we have tried to do for the sake of the experiment is to generate a state in which love and compassion permeate the whole mind with no other consideration, reasoning, or discursive thoughts. Now, you know, sometimes there are those commercials on television where it says in fine print underneath, "Don't try this at home." Well, in contrast to that, I would encourage you all to please do try this at home. But don't be frustrated if your mind is not able to focus in a way where there's no other consideration, reasoning, and discursive thoughts, because at least if your mind is like my mind, our thoughts and our minds are pretty chaotic. And there's lots of stuff happening. But one of the virtues of working with these very long-term practitioners is, at least by their own report, they're able to do this even in the really strange environment of our laboratory. So we have found that there are differences in brain electrical signals, and this is a figure from the very first paper that appeared on this study. And what it shows is that the oscillations that we record from the scalp surface are visibly different. You don't need fancy computer methods to extract these signals. You can see, if you look at the difference between the resting state and the meditation state, something is different in the brains. And these are gamma oscillations that are fast in frequency, about 40 cycles per second, and are seen in situations where different elements of a percept bind together in a normal brain, but they're typically seen for much shorter periods of time. Here we see them over much more extended periods of time. This is a picture of Mathieu after he had been in the scanner for more than 3 hours, and I can guarantee you, having done thousands of MRI studies, that most participants don't look like this when they come out of the scanner. So we've used these methods to learn what is changed in the brain during these kinds of practices. And I don't have a lot of time to go into detail here, but there are big changes that we see in a whole circuit that has been linked to such qualities as empathy, for example. So this is a slide where you see the brain image, and the area that's circled is an area called the insula, which is a very interesting part of the brain because it's the only part of the brain that has a map of the visceral organs in our body. It literally is the place in the brain where the information about the body is conveyed to other parts of the brain, and also the brain has an opportunity to control those parts of the body. And what we see is that in long-term practitioners, when they're exposed to sounds that depict human suffering, like sounds of a woman screaming, for example, or a baby crying unconsolably, this is an area of the brain that is dramatically enhanced in terms of the magnitude of the signal compared to novice practitioners who are just learning these kinds of practices. Now, we also see other areas of the brain that are modulated by these kinds of practices, and this slide is showing an area that's called the temporoparietal junction. It's in the back of the brain at the intersection between the temporal and the parietal lobe, and it's an area that in other research has been linked to perspective taking and has been very important in research on empathy. Now, one of the questions which is very frequently asked is, well, these are long-term practitioners. The average number of hours that these practitioners have spent training their mind is about 34,000. It's a big number. Most people who lead conventional lives are not going to dedicate that kind of time. So do short amounts of practice make a difference? This is findings from a very new study where we asked whether just 2 weeks of practice in otherwise meditation-naive individuals can actually produce a discernible change in the brain and behavior. And we had 30 minutes a day of practice for just 2 weeks, and we randomly assigned participants to either a compassion training group or to a group that learned to promote well-being through cognitive reappraisal, cognitive therapy, one of the most empirically well-validated psychological treatments for depression and other kinds of negative affective disorders. So we had 2 weeks of training, and they practiced they did the training over the internet. So we delivered the training through a protected website that they logged onto for 30 minutes a day. Let me just share with you very briefly the elements of the compassion training for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of training. So we first ask people to visualize different categories of individuals, and then while they're visualizing it, to contemplate a time in their life of those persons when they may have been suffering, and then to cultivate the strong wish that they be free from that suffering. And they begin this with a loved one, someone who may be a very close family member. or a very, very close friend. Visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then cultivate this strong aspiration that they be relieved of suffering. We then have them move on to themselves, where they do this practice for themselves. Then we have them move on to another category that we call a stranger. And what we mean by a stranger here is someone whose face you recognize. It may be a person who works in the same office building as you, that you see on a regular basis. You can recognize them, but you really know very little about their life. It may be a neighbor who you really haven't stopped to talk to very much. You really don't know much about them. Visualize them, and visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and cultivate that same aspiration. The next category is a really, really important category, and that is a difficult person. Bring to mind someone who really pushes your buttons, who makes you angry, and go through the same process. Visualize a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and cultivate that aspiration that they be relieved of suffering. And then we have them move on to all beings. They use a phrase that they repeat silently in their mind, like, may you be free of suffering, may you experience joy and ease. They're instructed to notice whatever visceral sensations may occur as they do this, and they're instructed to feel the compassion emotionally and not to simply repeat these phrases cognitively. Now, the way we did this study is we randomly assign people to one of these two groups, but first we do an MRI scan to look at their brain function before they are randomly assigned to these groups. They then go through 2 weeks of training. We do a second MRI scan, and we also give them some tasks that are economic decision-making tasks to assess their level of altruistic and cooperative behavior. I don't have time to talk about the details of that, but it's a way for us to measure pro-social behavior in a kind of hard-nosed way to see if this training makes a difference. And what we see is that after 2 weeks of training, the folks who are assigned to the compassion group are in fact behaving more altruistically, and remarkably, there are systematic changes in the brain that are produced after just 2 weeks of practice. And what's particularly interesting is that the extent to which their brain changes for the group that has been assigned to the compassion training group predicts how altruistic they behave on this economic decision-making task. And what is displayed here are two specific regions of the brain, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex in this area is showing enhanced activation over time with training. The amygdala, which is an area that's particularly important for detecting threat, is an area which is decreased over time. And actually, in Jonathan Haidt's talk just in the last period in this room, someone asked him a question about neurological differences between liberals and conservatives, and Jonathan mentioned the research showing that conservatives were perhaps more responsive to threat, and their threat system, if you will, is at a heightened level of activation or acuity, and the amygdala is a key component of that circuit. And so this kind of training is tuning down the amygdala. Whether it makes people less conservative, we don't know. We've not tested that. But there are also changes in other parts of the brain, including the nucleus accumbens that I talked about earlier. And so I'm going to end here and just refer you, if you have more questions, to the website of our new center, the Center for Investigating Healthy Minds. It's investigatinghealthyminds.org. You'll find a lot more information about our work there. These are the folks that actually do the studies, who I'm deeply grateful for on a daily basis. And I'd like to end with one of my very favorite quotes. This was written by Albert Einstein in 1921. He wrote this in a letter to a friend of his who was asking for some advice about his daughter that was really suffering. And Einstein said, "A human being is part of a whole, called by us the universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection, for a few persons nearest us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circles of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. Thank you.
Gentlemen, thank you. Those are wonderful talks. I'll ask a question, and I don't know how we're going to be how are we set up for Q&A? Do we have microphones stationed around? Oh, we have roving mics. Okay, great. Well, while you begin to rove, let me ask a question. I listened to both of your talks, and something occurred to me that kind of fell in the cracks between them. My theory of wanting and liking was always you want things, then you get them, then you like them, then you want new things. And that's, what a consumer society is about. Wanting and liking go hand in hand. But I remember when I was first introduced to our friend Mathieu Ricard, who's sitting back there, and we were having dinner. And, I know enough about Buddhism to know it's about getting rid of the wanting. And he was going after the cheesecake with great gusto. And I kept thinking, he sure looks like a guy who wants to me. But what you might be suggesting is, no, he's a guy who likes. And he may be able to give up wanting without giving up liking at all. And it made me wonder if the practices that you study, do we know whether they have this kind of effect? Or am I just making stuff up and bringing you guys together where you don't belong?
Well, I'll be happy to take a first stab at that. I think that one of the key attributes of wanting is expectation and anticipation. And one of the things that we've been directly studying is the period prior to an incentive, either to a positive incentive or a negative incentive. And if there really is a decrease in this wanting system, where there is a preservation of the liking, what we might see is in these long-term practitioners reduced activity during this period of anticipation, but normal or even perhaps enhanced activity during the period where the stimulus, if you will, is actually delivered, the incentive is delivered. And the early findings that we have, they're not fully cooked yet, but we're actively working on this, certainly are consistent with that conjecture.
So let me get this straight. I want cheesecake and he doesn't, but when he gets it, he likes it more? This is not fair. But that's what you're suggesting.
Yeah, that is.
All right, it's not a fair world. Ken.
Well, I'd absolutely concur with Richie that, the notion, when we say we want something, we usually mean we expect it, and we expect it to be valuable and pleasant when we get it, and therefore we like it. And that's what we mean. At the same time, our brain is doing that. And in a perfect world, we would expect what would make us happy, we would work and obtain that, and it would make us happy. But at the same time the brain is doing that, it's doing other things, I think. And even wanting itself can fragment into a couple of different kinds of things. So the notion of expecting something to be good, that's what we're consciously aware of, and it's great to know that the cortex activates in consonance with that. That mesolimbic dopamine system that's driving a kind of wanting, it's usually going, I think, with this expectation, and so the accumbens activates in Richie's studies. That's marvelous. But it can separate possibly from the expectations, too, sometimes. There are human cases where the dopamine wanting can occur in the absence of an expectation, kind of almost an unconscious wanting. There are other cases where you can kind of pull it apart. You expect one thing. You expect something not to be good, for example, and yet you might want it, that the addict can fall into this kind of situation. So I think there's a complexity within us.
Why does nature build that complexity? I mean, if you'd asked me to design an animal, I'd say make it want sex, make it want food, and make it be satisfied when it gets what it wants. We're not designed that way. Any thoughts about why?
Shall I go first? I think we'd all agree that's the way we should design the brain. And if anybody had consulted us, that's the brain. It's that evolution has been a slow process and always adding things on. So what's there first stays. Evolution isn't going to take it away, but it adds on. And so we have new capacities as we add on, and that's marvelous, and new opportunities. But what was there is still there, usually operating in concert with what's new. But it still has its old rules, and so every once in a while those rules jump up and sort of hit us in the face.
So wanting came first.
The old wanting came first.
Well, I think that in humans we see the evolution of the prefrontal cortex, which is this huge mass that is greater in size in humans relative to the rest of the brain mass, at least in particular regions, than any other species. And one of the things that has allowed us to do is to do mental time travel so that we can anticipate the future, we can recollect in the past, which gives us many advantages, but it also has some disadvantageous byproducts. And so humans have the capacity to regulate their emotions in ways, I think, which are probably far more nuanced than any other species, but we also can dysregulate and mess up our emotions in ways that are much greater than other species. The incidence of psychopathology in humans is clearly much greater than it is in any other species, in part because of the hijacking of this prefrontal system where we get ourselves into trouble so that we end up wanting things that turn out not to be particularly beneficial.
Well, I know I want an umbrella or a friend with an umbrella. Let's open up the floor to questions, and we'll bring the microphones around. Sir, in the front, let's get a microphone to this gentleman.
Gentlemen, thanks for doing this. My name is Chris Gates, and I'm from New York. And one of the things I know that I want is I want to be right. And I've discovered about myself, and I don't like this about myself, but I'd rather be right than eat. And even when I'm wrong, I'm right about that. So is that an amygdala attack? And if that happens, should I just quarantine myself until it goes away, or how do we deal with it? How do I deal with it?
Well, I think that the cortical system that we have in humans allows us to put a wedge, if you will, between the wanting system and our actions that may be based upon it. And so we can actually notice, and this is one thing that the meditative practices actually teach a person to do, is the process of wanting or urges or cravings will arise. But if you can cultivate the capacity to just notice them instead of having them hijack you, then they eventually will change and subside. And I think it will. It's a way to change one's relationships to wanting, and that implies also changes in how different networks in the brain interact, which I think is impacted by the kind of training that I was describing.
There's a wonderful book by Catherine Schultz called Being Wrong, and it's written for you. The microphone to Madam with the white shirt.
I'm curious what you think about people. We all know people who view life through the glasses half empty lens, a little cynical, and sometimes they exhibit those characteristics from a very early time in their life. Do you believe that is learned behavior, or something is different about their brain chemical state?
We can imagine it either way, I think. We can imagine it both ways. If it's true that primitive liking pleasure system generates a sense of life half full or more than half full, that system is just ready to be tuned by genes. There are many genes we can imagine that would change it, just as drugs temporarily change it. At the same time, it's not an encapsulated system. Nothing in the brain is. It's always interacting with our experiences, and it may well be that the kinds of practices Richie is exploring and that we heard about in earlier sessions could change the capacity of these systems to be engaged on a daily basis by by mundane events, which is something I think we'd all aspire to.
Yeah, I just to add a little bit, I think that it's likely both heritable contributions as well as experiential environmental contributions. Kent showed the wonderful video clips of the infant and the rat in response to taste. We actually did a study a number of years ago. It was published, I think, in 1986 or 87, with newborn infants. These were infants 72 hours of age, where we introduced tastes of that sort and looked at their brain function to look at how these different facial reactions in the newborn period are associated with different patterns of brain function. But one of the things that you see even in neonates 72 hours old is a lot of variation consistent with your idea. So even though on average most infants do have this normative response to a sweet taste and a kind of disgust expression to the bitter taste, there's a lot of variation. Whether that variation actually predicts subsequent temperament, I am actually skeptical, and I think that increasing amounts of evidence suggest that particularly in the pre-adolescent years, there's a tremendous amount of change. And who you are as a neonate is not necessarily who you're going to be as a young adult.
Great. Can we get one microphone to the gentleman in the blue shirt right there? And while we're doing that, can we get a second microphone to anyone who has a question? The gentleman in the yellow back there. He'll be ready when...
I have a friend that has a bionic implant in his brain because he has Parkinson's disease, and it's helped his personality. Would you recommend that we all do that, make ourselves better people?
So the technology that we have today isn't something that we'd all choose unless we had Parkinson's disease. You know, the kind of changes in mood and sometimes changes in motivation, sometimes changes in urges to do things that can happen with deep brain stimulation and with some of the medications for Parkinson's disease, where people suddenly have urges to do all kinds of things that they didn't before or more intensely. That's not something we'd probably choose. It's a side effect. But we can imagine a perfect world in which techniques like the sort that Richie and Matthew discussed, or an imaginary perfect world in which it was possible to sort of reach in and fine-tune and produce the desired outcome in the neurons. We can imagine that world in which one could turn on a hedonic system and raise the pleasure in life, possibly adjust the wanting and zest of life. We can imagine that. Whether that's ever actually going to be possible, well, we can't foresee that with the techniques, even on the horizon, in a way that anybody would choose, I think. But we can imagine that.
Great. We'll go to the gentleman who has the microphone and pass the other microphone to this gentleman here.
Yes, you've identified the pleasure center of the brain. Is this also the displeasure center? In other words, is pleasure and displeasure on a continuum with the volume control there? And does that at all relate to bipolar?
I think that's a fascinating question. We don't fully know the answer. We know part of the answer. Part of the answer is brain sites that create pleasure aren't always the same sites that control displeasure, but some of them are. So in the nucleus accumbens hotspot, for example, if you turn it on, pleasures get better. If a lesion happens to the accumbens, pleasures don't go away. They just go back down to a sort of low normal baseline. But in other parts of the brain, like the ventral pallidum, if we turn it on, we create enhanced, intense pleasure. And if it's lesioned, nice becomes nasty. Even a sugar suddenly becomes bitter and aversive. This is a lesion that can be produced in studies in rats. It's not something that's going to often happen to a person because of the placement of the ventral pallidum. People who have that lesion would be usually obliterated. But there are a couple of cases where selective damage to the ventral pallidum produces this great dysphoria, and sensory pleasures like drugs or foods that once were sought after very much become less pleasant to that person. It is in the reports. Whether it's the cause of things like bipolar disorders or other affective disorders, that's an open question. It could be the cause. That's the sort of potential relevance of these kinds of facts. But whether it actually is the cause, I don't think we have answers.
And if I can just add one piece to that, I think it's the case, and I don't think most scientists would disagree with this, that particularly complex qualities like eudaimonic happiness as well as bipolar disorder are not going to be isolated to any single part of the brain. These are more complex networks that are instantiated in distributed systems. And one of the things that is true about all of the regions that Kent has been talking about is that they're very densely interconnected. They're actually part of an extended circuit, and there is a lot of interaction among those different parts of the brain and interaction between those parts and certain cortical regions. And so I think that ultimately it's going to require that we take into account a whole circuit rather than the individual spots.
That microphone to the gentleman in black, and your question, sir.
I was most struck by how compassion-based meditation causes a permanent change in the brain to increase those centers you were talking about. It reminded me of when the Grinch's heart grew 3 sizes. But I was wondering if the reverse is true. If, like addiction, long-term selfishness, for a better word, causes damage to the pleasure centers of the brain. In other words, is there any evidence for the plot of Citizen Kane?
I think it's a wonderful question. First, let me just correct what may have been a misunderstanding. I wasn't suggesting that compassion meditation from the studies that we've done produces a permanent change in the brain. We don't know whether it does or not. But I think that your intuition is exactly right. I think that deleterious environmental influences will have and have been found to have a negative impact on the brain. One of the things that we study in addition to the positive side of life, we've been doing this study of brain function and structure among maltreated kids. These are kids with documented maltreatment, and not just the function of their brain, but the structure of their brain is demonstrably altered by these kinds of experiences. And so I think the answer is absolutely yes. And in a very recent study from a group at McGill University, they've actually, using the brains following suicide among a group of maltreated individuals, they actually have found epigenetic changes in the brain. That is, actually changes in the regulation of particular genes that are in specific brain sites that are important in the modulation of negative emotion. So these are, I think, important clues that this works in both directions.
Very important. So next.
Thank you very much for sharing all your data and ideas. A couple of quick questions. One is, can you please comment on left brain, right brain differences? Because I noticed in a number of the functional imaging studies, there seem to be hemispheric differences, and perhaps they even extend into the subcortex and brainstem. It would be interesting to know. The second part of it is a little bit of a philosophy of language question. Much of what we're talking about in terms of our internal states is ineffable. And if you are training someone up on an economic decision-making task, you're engaging the language module where it never actually really plays in sort of moment-to-moment everyday life. So could you comment a little bit on the methodological issues pertaining to engagement of language in these sort of non-linguistic internal states as well?
Yeah, well, they're great questions. To answer them briefly, in terms of the left-right business, for a good part of my career, I studied, and still do to some extent, hemispheric differences, and we've reported in many papers that individuals who at baseline, that is not during any instructed task, just while they're sitting and resting, individuals who have greater activation in certain left prefrontal regions report higher levels of well-being and are happier on certain self-report measures. Now, we've interpreted that as that these individuals have a more engaged approach motivation system or a more activated approach motivation system. These are the kind of people who may be the sort that when they get up in the morning, they're just ready to sort of be positively engaged with the world. But those qualities are temperamental qualities which don't necessarily map onto the full spectrum of eudaimonic well-being that I'm describing. And I can tell you that as a group, long-term meditation practitioners do not have extreme levels of left prefrontal activation. So it's an interesting dimension, but it's not exactly, it doesn't exactly map on to this. Your second question about language, let me just say that one of the reasons why we have been interested in the project of working with long-term practitioners is based upon a conjecture. And the conjecture is this, that these are individuals, well, let me just say that the word meditation in the Sanskrit, one of the Sanskrit translations, literally means familiarization. So these are individuals who could be said to be very familiar with their own mind. And as such, those individuals may be more accurate reporters of what's going on in their mind compared to others who don't spend a lot of time actually engaged in that kind of systematic introspection. And on that conjecture, one might hypothesize that those individuals should show tighter relations between their reports of experience and measures of brain function. And in fact, in some of our work, it's exactly what we found. It's not true for all dimensions, but for some dimensions, particularly those dimensions that they are accustomed to reflecting upon, they are the ones that show these very tight associations. So I would say that even though, yes, it's true that it is a very different kind of dimension, they're still able to provide reports which show some, in certain cases, very high degrees of association with objective measures of the brain that we can obtain simultaneously.
Another question. Anyone over here? Another question. Can you pass your microphone, sir, who just spoke, back to the woman who's standing, and then we'll go to where the other mic is, and these will be our last two questions. Sir.
Today is the first time I've ever heard about compassion meditation. I've only known of meditation. So are there different types of meditation? Are they all effective, or is there compassion meditation, which is a very specific form of meditation, and where do you learn it? And my other question is
what one? We'll leave it at one if we can, because we're out of time. Thank you.
Sure. Very, very briefly, the word meditation is kind of like the word sports. There are many different kinds of sports. Some are more solitary, some are more done in groups, more active. So there are hundreds of different kinds of meditation practices. But one we've described, we've tried to come up with a research-based typology of different kinds of practices, and we've distinguished among three kinds. One is a kind that involves very focused attention. A second is a kind that involves what we call open monitoring, where the field of awareness is much broader. And the third kind we call positive affect training, which is where the compassion meditation would fall. They are practices which are explicitly designed to promote certain types of positive affect.
Wonderful. For our final question, ma'am.
So I have a question. So I just watched a teenage daughter of mine conceive of a future for herself, choose it, and then spend a year delaying, giving up all kinds of gratifications in order to bring that future into her life. I'm just really interested in what is that system's relationship to the wanting system that allows us to really conceive of a future and then bring it forth with very much more, longer-term series of actions.
I'd imagine that system is much related to the kind of mindfulness system that Richie Matthew also pursued. The notion of bringing the wants under the control of larger plans and better plans. And the kinds of systems that Richie is studying, I would hope, are the kinds of systems that achieve that control.
There will be more Psychology and Happiness at 5 o'clock. Until then, I hope your brain is as excited, wanting, and liking as mine. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.